A very warm welcome and good morning to all of you who've joined today's workshop on how to write an academic journal article. This is in a series of many different workshops that we plan as part of the Secretariat, and it was actually a lot of you who had requested that as you're completing your research projects, it would be good to have some of us share how do we write articles and what are the ways to go forward in doing this work. So we decided to have this workshop, which is unfortunately still online. It's been 2 years that all of us have been trying to interact online and trying to make the most being online, but hopefully in the coming months, we should also try and have some of these things in person. And I'm definitely hoping that towards the end of the year and early next year, we will plan for similar sessions, which would be more hands-on and more in-person, doing these workshops in different places, because several of you are again in different countries, and nothing beats and coming together in person for workshops like this. So thank you all for joining in. And before we start off, I'd like to hand over to our SSC member, Madam Long, to give us the welcome remarks for the session. Over to you, Ms. Long.
Yeah, thank you, Sumita. And good morning to you all, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. And it's my pleasure to be here, the training on the how to write on the academic journal article. And on behalf of the SUMERNET Steering Committee, I would like to welcome all of you. It's also our pleasure to run this online workshop where we will have Dr. Lebel, the Director Unit of Social and Environment Research, Department of Social Science and Department, Faculty of Social Science in Chiang University. He will share the key points of the process on writing for an academic journal. And as you know, Dr. Lebel has more than 25 years of experience in academic writing and research. And his special area of the expertise include the qualitative and qualitative methods, research, study design, and writing. And I also would like to take this opportunity to welcome our panelists. Firstly, Dr. Saram Shara, the Professor and Chair of Water Engineering and Management Program at Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand. And Dr. Saram, he will have more than 85 papers already published. And secondly, we would like to welcome Dr. Kanokwan Manorom as the Associate Professor, Department of Social Science, Faculty of Liberal Arts, the Ubon Ratchathani University, Thailand. She comes with 25 years already of experience working research and practice. She has been involved with the policy recommendation on dam irrigation and land resources management and development in the Northeast region of Thailand and Mekong regions. And third, we would like to welcome Dr. Pheakkdey, the forest governance expert, Europe Forest Institute, Phnom Penh, Cambodia. He comes with 20 years of experience and research and expert. And finally, the panelist is Dr. Pichamon, Yeophantong. She associate professor and the head of research Center for Future Defense and National Security, Deakin University. Pichamon is a political scientist and China specialist. Her research focuses on the Chinese foreign policy and the political economy on sustainable development in the Asia Pacific. She deeply come to support the next generation of the scholar practitioners. Yes, and thank you all of you to making time to be here for sharing your experience and tips on publishing for academic writing. And I wish a very fruitful planning today and wishing all of you and your family healthy and success. Thank you very much. So over to you, Sumita. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Long, and thank you to all of you for making the time to share your experiences with our participants. And so before we move on, I'd just like to go over the agenda for the day so that we exactly know what we are going through. So Madam Long has given the welcome remarks. So very soon we'll have a quick icebreaker session, and after that, Dr. Lewis will share some of the tips on how to write an academic journal article, his experiences and what he thinks are the main aspects to focus on. Followed by Dr. Lewis's presentation would be a panel discussion where we would be opening it up to all of you to be able to ask questions. We'll try and ask a few questions to the panelists to get you all started. But in order to ask those questions, all of you can either type it in the chat box or raise your hand and ask the question. We will let you unmute your mic when you raise your hand, and then we can get you to ask those questions. And then we'll, after the panel discussion is over, we would share some of the resources that we have at SUMERNET. So that's the flow of the day. And we really hope all of you do engage and ask as many questions that you might have. Several of you are in different stages of writing your papers. So there would be things that you would want to focus on. And no question is a wrong question. Every question is worth asking. And therefore, please do not be hesitant in asking any question. Go ahead and ask the questions that you have. You have a very distinguished panel here from different disciplinary backgrounds, because that was the aim, that all of us in SUMERNET are doing many different aspects of research within water insecurity. And it's keeping in view all of that, that we thought that we'd have a cross-cutting way of looking at how we therefore look at engaging with academic writing. So before I hand over to Dr. Lewis, we just wanted to do a quick icebreaker, and Agus will put it up on the screen. So you can either direct your phones and use the QR code to respond to it, or you can use the link that's there and respond to the questions. There are a couple of questions, and just give us a little bit of, so if you've directed your point, you can point your phones to capture the QR code and then get on to the survey.
Can you say the link in the chat box?
Yeah, the link has been shared on the chat box as well. So you could use both the forms of doing it. And we'll show the results online as they happen. So the first question, have you published an academic journal article before? A simple answer. I hope all of you are responding to it. We have several of you here. Just a couple more seconds and we move to the next. Wow, that's good to know that almost 80% of you have published an academic journal article and would hopefully have lots of questions for our panel to respond to. On to the next question. So moving on to the next question, which part or section of an academic journal article you find most difficult to write? I'm sure all of you would have parts that, and if there are too many of the others that are not there in this, then we'll see if we can get some of you to speak to that. Interesting. So a lot of you find it difficult. Okay. Almost 50% have said difficulty in shaping the discussion section. Some of you have mentioned abstract. And some of you have talked about the introduction and a few on methodology and the results. Any more? Couple more minutes and we move on, seconds, and we move on to the next question. And here's the third one. At which stage do you think it's best to begin drafting your academic journal article? And the responses are slowly pouring in. Very interesting results of at the start of research, 50%. When I start having results, another 50%.
Does that mean I can go home, Sushmita?
Very, very interesting. You guys are already doing quite well on this, I should say. You're going to have an interesting session, Adan Louis. On to the last question. So what is your main motivation to write and publish in an academic journal? This would be interesting to see how people respond to this. In academic circles, there's always this statement that publish or perish. What do we see? Fair enough. Career advancement. A few more coming in. I'll just give 2 more seconds and we close this. Donor requirement, that seems to be another one that's picking up. And coming from South Asia, I see that the donor requirement is something which I have found very unique to this region. And I have been reflecting on what may be the reasons for this, that probably there's a lot more focus on how donors are supporting research projects and research networks in this region, possibly. And that may be one reason that it's become a key reason. Almost 20%, 21% people have responded back. So thank you everyone for engaging in this survey. And before I give it to Dr. Lewis, can we all switch on our cameras so that we can take a quick online photograph of all of us together for this session? Anjali, can you get everyone to?
Okay, I'm Anjali here from the Secretariat room. So I'm asking everyone to just give us a big smile for this morning. And we will take a photo, a group photo. Actually, if you can just hold on a bit. For those who are not ready, We are going to count in 3. Make sure you turn on the light as well. We may ask you just only few seconds. So the first group. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Next one, keep you smiling. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali, for getting us all together. So over to you, Dr. Lewis, to share some of your thoughts on how do we write and how do we engage with writing an academic article.
Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Please let me know if the screen is now visible.
Yes, the screen is visible. You have to go on full screen mode. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so thank you participants for giving your inputs. You almost make me obsolete before I start. So in this talk, I'm going to give you some tips and pointers and some examples. And the main argument I'm going to make with you is when you're writing a new paper or revising an old one that isn't published yet, you should look very closely at the purpose statement. And I'm going to suggest that you start writing a paper with a structured abstract. You actually start with a full abstract. It's kind of like a condensed version of how you imagine your paper to be. And then I'll give you some ideas and ways to solve problems in introductions, findings, discussions, and a few points about submission, which the panelist, I think, is going to talk a lot more about. So for me, why I write, the main motivation for me is to understand. I don't really understand things until I've written them out properly. And even then I may discover I didn't understand it before I thought I did. So just two slides about writing. As we're all, I think all of us, in English is not the first language. It's not mine either. Is to keep sentences short. Use simple English, define key terms, be specific, avoid, that's one of the things about academic writing is that we should be specific, not broad and general and vague. In English, writing paragraphs is the key. It's a structural thing that you don't have in all other languages. There's a kind of a block of text that's separate from another block of text. It's a handy way to break up different parts of an argument. I suggest for people who are not highly skillful at writing, but even those that are skillful at writing, is to often start the sentence of a paragraph with a topic sentence that tells you what this paragraph's about. Water systems are important to insecurities and practices. It's very short. It's an assertion, and then you've got to actually show that in the next couple of the sentences in that paragraph, or people are going to argue with you. How do you know that? So you can start with an assertion, or you can start with an issue, and then review the topic and come to a conclusion at the end of a paragraph. So a paragraph shouldn't cover 7 different topics. If you said this is about insecurities and water, this is about water systems, then you shouldn't be talking about climate change in it. We shouldn't be talking about gender relations in it. You talk about, or not. If this is water systems, it's about the technology. So paragraphs are really important. And the second key message is to really write as you go, which everyone said. And that means you have to read what you write and you have to rewrite it. Look at what you've written. Is the flow logical as you go from paragraph to paragraph? Or does it just suddenly jump into a new stream? Are the arguments clear? Academic writing is about arguments. It's about making assertions, discussing the evidence that's for and against, and drawing a conclusion again and again and again through a paper. Are your claims supported? Can you be more precise? Often you can be. And can you say it more simply? So one of the things, tricks I find to help me write a new paper or to fix a paper that's stuck or got rejected or just is in a mess is to go back to the purpose statement. And I think you should state the purpose early on in 2 sentences, early on in the paper, in the actual manuscript. It might be in the abstract in short form already says the purpose of this paper is. In the introduction, it may have a longer version with some scoping sense. Even the title may imply the purpose because it's got some keywords in it. But when do you do it? That's where. But when do you do it? I do it before I start writing the rest of the paper. And I really push myself to focus on writing that perfect purpose statement that really captures what this paper is going to be about. And certainly, after you've done a version of a paper, you left it for a month, you come back to it and you think, this is rubbish. What have I done? Go back and look at your purpose statement. Maybe you actually didn't have the idea of the paper clear in your head the first time round. If you get it clear, you can. If you've got a PhD thesis with 3 papers or 4 papers, or you're working on a 3-year project, which maybe has 10 papers written with colleagues, etc., having a clear purpose statement to say, this paper is about this paper is about that, this paper is about this third topic, can help you plan ahead your writing. Here's one example on the right. The purpose of this paper is to analyze how transboundary policy narratives have affected support for and decisions around the East-West Economic Corridor. That's in one sense, it says to analyze something. It's kind of boring. It's not a very big, not a very interesting purpose. But when you look at some of the other words, and then it's linking to some bodies of theory and scholarship, transboundary policy narratives, East-West economic corridors. It's about the large-scale development, about politics, perhaps. They ask about decisions. Something Pichamon may have written papers of this style when she thinks about the influence of China. Here's 2 other examples from papers we've published. In this paper, we explain a shift from culture of the native black tiger shrimp. So this is a paper about innovation, about how a whole system of growing shrimp in Thailand shifted from many participants, many hatcheries, getting the adult fish and adult shrimp in the wild in a speedboat, bringing it on shore, making lots of babies, and then growing them up to a white shrimp that is, you just grow it in the lab in comparison. It came from Hawaii, it's not even native. And the Thai puzzle is Thailand completely flipped from one to another. Why? The number 1 export earner suddenly shifted totally. So this paper often explains the puzzle. It takes this big change and offers an explanation for why it is. That's one of the purpose of the paper. Here's another one. This one is from the SUMERNET paper I wrote with Long Chao and others in the SUMERNET steering committee about COVID-19. And this describes the purpose of this study, but it's not overly ambitious either. It's just to better understand. But we know when we read it, we know it's about household water access. So it's not about irrigation directly. And in vulnerable communities, we don't know which ones yet. We'd hope the paper would tell us in the next sentence. So the purpose statements are come of different sorts. This can be fill a gap of knowledge, offer an explanation for a puzzle, provide new interpretation of existing knowledge, may test a proposition. Some other author has suggested this causes this everywhere, and you've got a study that shows the opposite. Some papers are about theory or conceptualization. It could be about methods, or might synthesize or integrate information in a new way. So when you're thinking about your purpose statement, you can make it stronger than the examples I gave. But think about whether is this really about method, theory, synthesis, interpretation, explanation, fill a gap. So what I'd like to do now is ask the participants, and the panelists are welcome to do too, is to write the statement of a paper that you're currently working on, not yet submitted, not yet finished. You're not allowed to look up in your laptop and cut and paste. I want you to write it off the top of your head and put it into the chat box. You can put the purpose of this article is to, in this paper, the main objective. Doesn't matter how you start it. Can you please write a purpose statement for a current paper you're working on? Maybe you have revising one that's giving you a lot of trouble. Don't look it up, just write, and we'll just give you 1 or 2 minutes. Can you please put it from your head? The purpose of this paper is that, write it out. 1 sentence. Panelists, feel free to participate too. But no searching on your computer for that perfect piece of text.
How much time are we giving everybody? 2 minutes?
2 minutes. And I'm going to have to see the chat somehow. Got to figure out how I do that.
Yeah, you just have to use the chat box. If you just click on that and it will open up on the right side.
Can't seem to raise it. I might have to escape.
Yeah, you have to skip.
Okay, now.
Yeah. That's great. We have Ratchathani who has typed in on the chat box.
So this LP's example is a one where it's about comparison.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one from Taiwan Fong Lan is quite clear. When we see his, the TH one, we will be wondering about how he measures the level of participation. I wonder what kind of water management. Those are things that may follow in the sentence that come below. So, Sangam is also clear. Analyze the impacts of climate change on river discharge. So he gave us the idea of the two main types of variables he's interested in. Kanokwan's one sounds like might be similar to the East-West Economic Corridor sharing prosperity style. And she's going to turn it into a debate, which is interesting. Please, any other participants, please far away. In my view, when you write these purpose statements, you really get an idea of what things your paper is about. Sushmita, are you?
I haven't written anything recently.
Okay, 3 tones, one's a little bit more complex. But poor user group, okay. Wetlands, it's about wetland governance. But there's quite a few terms in the following sentences he would have to explain. That's okay. Grand narratives of forest poverty discourse also. I'm sure Kanokwan would add some sense of elaboration to follow. How are we going for Sushmita? How are we going for time? Okay?
Yes, we are okay.
Okay, so I hope people did that exercise quite well.
Yes.
I would propose to you that if you get stuck again in the future, go back to your purpose statement as one of the first things to look at and see if actually there's problems there, because since you wrote the proposal and now it's actually different. When you come to write the paper, it might only cover one part of the proposal. The proposal may have had a lot of problems with some types of data collection, and or you change your research question, etc. So I'll move on. So the purpose statement is one important piece of thinking about a paper in a new way. I like, and I've tried with quite advanced as well as more junior researchers, to write an abstract on the first day for a paper we haven't written yet. We actually try to write a structured abstract. A structured abstract is one where you talk about the rationale, you talk about objective or purpose, you talk about study design, findings, and significance and conclusion. For a paper you don't have results for yet. So clearly the findings will be something like expected findings, and the significance will be significance, maybe a topic or area where you expect it in the first draft. This helps you refine what a paper is about. When you see that, read through your structured abstract, you now have quite an idea, can imagine the paper. It's useful to have a structured abstract early on, because you can then use it for going to conferences. You don't have to rewrite it again, or book proposals, or special issues. If you have a set of papers, it helps quite a lot in making sure you don't repeat yourself. And you can keep revising it. So I did my abstract starts off in draft 1, but by the final submission draft, it may be a totally different abstract. But I've always had a mini snapshot or summary of the paper from day 1. And you can use a structured abstract even if the journal doesn't. Don't worry that we're not worried about whether the journal allows structured abstract or not. This is to do it for our own purposes, for our own thinking. And then when we get near submission stage, we go to their format. This is for us. So here's an example of the paper that the SUMERNET SC members wrote about COVID-19 and access to water. The top of the abstract, in the actual paper that's published, there's none of these headings. It's just a big massive jumble of text. But it actually is structured as an abstract because we put it there, then we cut out the bold parts when we went to submission time. So there's an example, access to data, but we don't know we don't know what influence COVID-19 on water insecurities. That's the question, the puzzle. The purpose is to look at the association between control measures and household water insecurities. Control measures means social distancing. It means restrictions on moving between provinces or districts, lockdowns, etc. So the design, in this case, the structure abstract doesn't say very much about design. We know it's in vulnerable communities and it's in 5 countries. Probably could say a bit more. And if you look at this abstract, there's a lot, half of it's on findings, so it's not very well balanced. When I go back and analyze it, I would say, should have said more about design. But there is a clear statement of significance at the end. It really says we should, when COVID-19 was first being reported around the world, we should really be looking at people who are water insecure as a high-risk group. That was the significance of the finding. The overall structure, so for those people who feel that their paper's stuck in their revisions or are writing a paper new, after this workshop, I'd like to strongly encourage you to try to do a structured abstract for it. It's one of the best ways I've found for solving paper organization or new paper idea problems. And then I actually keep it and keep revising it. As I make significant revisions, I revise my abstract again. The overall structure of an academic journal article, the kind of on the left side is the classic structure with the typical length in words. It goes introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. That's a pretty typical structure of a paper. It's very conventional science. It suits social science papers that have big surveys. And the results section in particular can be organized around the questions. So it can be a very efficient way of writing. And an alternative way is one where your field or the style of contribution you're making requires a bit more review because it's related to theory or concepts. So you may have like a double introduction that sets up the problem, sets up the purpose statements, that justifies the interest in the area, and then you have an actual review section within the paper. And in those types of papers, typically, there's not one results section, there may be 2 or 3 with thematic headings. So I think the classic one is a good way to start, but by the end, you'll often end up with, you may end up with something more like the one on the right as you get near a submission. How do you write an introduction? So 25% of people had some problems with introductions. And I think I'm going to give 2 structures to help that I found useful. The first one is to start with an opening. And that means you don't start with a paragraph saying sustainable development goals are very important for the Mekong region. Climate change is happening everywhere. We don't love Mother Nature enough. You know, very broad, general things. Unless it's a paper about global discourses or something, you shouldn't see that in the first paragraph. Get into the topic right away is my recommendation. So the opening can be a teaser, an entrance, compass, gives a direction, but it really says something close to the heart of the paper really, really early on. Then, of course, there's some issues, concepts, or theories that we need to cover. We have to review what is known and zooming in on our problem area. rationale and justification need for your study. The statement of purpose that we drafted appears there, and with maybe some additional definitions or scoping modifiers saying we only studied rich houses, we only studied poor houses. Then the last paragraph, which maybe includes the research questions. So this is one kind of structure, but when you look at it, you can see there can be a problem. This is almost the classical structure. The problem is that when somebody's reading your introduction, they don't know what your paper is really about until they get to the statement of purpose. They may get an idea from the opening, but there's a lot of review. You might not get it to what this paper is really about until page 4 or 5. And that's in the day and age when people have not much time, that's a real problem. So an alternative structure is to go something more like this. You start with the problem statement, rationale and statement of purpose. So you get to your point of what this paper about is really quickly, and then you review and go into depth. So you put it, you declare this paper is about X really early on in the paper. So what I can do, if required, is show some examples later if needed. But obviously on the big screen, it's not always so easy to read the text, but we can look at some examples. And this PowerPoint or PDF file will be available to all participants too. So there's 2 ways of structuring the introduction. Now, one is a kind of a classical way, and the second one is to bring the purpose problem right up front, and then review and then come back to your description of what's to come. So reviewing the literature is important. You'll notice when you look at the introduction and discussion, you need it to strengthen your rationale. You need it to build a conceptual framework. You need it in the methods section to study design choices. In introduction and in the discussion, you need it to relate your work to the work of others and to integrate findings with previous scholarship. So reviewing the literature is an important part of writing an academic paper. You need it in lots of places. So you have to get good and efficient at it. Probably how to do a review is worth another seminar in itself, but in fact, you're going to have to make many reviews to finish a paper. What about the methods section? That should explain what you did and describe the study design. My experience working in SUMERNET and in Southeast Asia region is often that method sections are rather weak, especially in the non-high-tech sciences. It's important that you explain what is compared, what's your primary interest is in chances of getting COVID-19 infection or your access to household water. You should explain how the people you interviewed or the documents you analyzed, how they were chosen, how you searched, what were your inclusion-exclusion criteria, what period of time did you cover. So method section has to have some detail. If you have a lot of information here, you can put it in what they call supplementary materials. These are most journals now have a place where you can add another file that will have a link from your main document to the supplementary materials. But the methods, you need to describe enough in the main paper that people can understand what you did. Typically, I'll just give 2 examples of papers. The methods, one way to force you to write more detailed methods is to put subheadings. So they can be in, on the left one, there's an example, you talk about data collection, then you're talking about coding or data analysis, and then there's data preparation and then data analysis. On the right one, there's something about interviews, there's something about measurements, there's something about analysis, and there's something about quality information. So that order is really odd and not very clear. But the topics may be helpful. So this is using outline feature in Word. So if you use outline feature in Word, it's very easy to reorganize and restructure. The results section, we analyze your evidence. And my strong suggestion in the results section is to really prioritize findings that relate to your research question, your conceptual framework, and your purpose statement. Don't go outside that. If it's not in the purpose statement, it's not in your research questions, it shouldn't be in there. There shouldn't be very much that in the results about those things that are outside it. You can have a little bit, but really prioritize answering your research questions. summarizing the evidence for your research questions. Use subheadings, and there are maybe cleverer ways to write a particular paper, but presenting the results in question 1, question 2, question 3 is the easiest way. And I recommend, if you're having trouble writing, start that way. Follow the research questions when you structure your statements. You should analyze, not just describe. So you say informant 1 said this, informant 2 said that, informant 3 said that, informant 4 said that. That's just describing. The younger informant said Y, while the older informant said Z. Now you've got some analysis. This may be, I'm interested to see what the panelists think, but I believe keeping the results and discussion separate is a good idea in your initial drafts to help the young author really separate what is evidence, things that they got from their information, they got from the interviews, they got from their survey tools, from their direct observation, etc., and what it means, and what it yeah. So I'll be interested to see what others think. But as you write on, you may decide to bring them together. That's fine. The results section should not have big statements that with no supporting evidence. Not there. And you shouldn't be citing other people's papers a lot in a results section unless you're analyzing discourses or something like that, and their texts are actually your data. Make use of tables and figures, but don't repeat things, and use supplemental materials. And again, careful use of subheadings can really help people understand what they're going to see in the results. So on the left-hand side, that narratives paper, there is no results section. It's more the non-classical outline. There's something about what are the nexus narratives, and there's something about how they're used by actors in the Mekong region, the use and influence. So those are the two themes, and there's some sub-themes underneath them. The one on the right, again, is actually follows the research questions. When drafting text, qualitative text, I strongly recommend you keep clear notes on the source of a direct quote, like the top one is from the Lao informant number 4. Always stays attached to that quote. So we can know it was an official in Laos that said this. The bottom one, there's no quote, but there's still, the claims come from somewhere. They came from Thai informant 5 and 11, and they came from Lao informant 5 and 2. It's possible some journals won't allow you to keep these, but while you're drafting, you always know where you got your information from. And then you've got a table in the back. I won't go into details this, but qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence have their own styles of presentation. But writing mixed methods, I think, is the key one for a lot of our SUMERNET projects, because a lot of them involve qualitative methods as well as some survey elements, and you're trying to put them together. And one way to do it, I'm not saying that every paragraph has to be this style, but one way to bring those two types of evidence together is to state something about a lot of farmers understood X. So you're talking about the prevalence, it's 50%, 80%, a high amount, big difference, a small difference, the negative association, positive, and then use the quantitative interviews or the participant observation techniques or the rapid rural appraisal, things you said, to explain and nuance the broad statistical claim. And show that actually it doesn't always apply. Sometimes the interesting people are the ones that are in the 10% category, not the dominant category. So getting near towards the end. In the discussion section, you focus on the findings and implications. And again, one of the easier way to organize the discussion is to start with your research questions and synthesize your response to research question 1, 2, 3, and then go back to your purpose statement. While you're synthesizing your answer to your research questions, the second half of every paragraph, if you have one paragraph on each, could be about relating, could be about alternative explanations or your assessment of the balance of the evidence. Because sometimes you find some positive evidence for your research question, and sometimes you find some negative evidence. And this is where you should discuss it. And you may discuss it in relation to other literature as well. So that first part of the discussion is a bit more tightly connected to your results, to the evidence you've got. While the next section or sections might be about implications, maybe going a little bit beyond your results and thinking about what it means for policy, what it means for practice, what it means for advocacy, what it means for modeling. So critically evaluate your limitations. I strongly encourage writers to do this in at least one paragraph towards the end of the discussion, because if you don't, the reviewers will. And one of the best ways to help your paper get through is for them to see that you're humble, that you have thought deeply about it, and you can identify some of the key limitations. And the key limitation is not that it was hot, that you were tired, or you didn't have enough money. State the significance for understanding scholarship and drawing conclusions. This is really tough, but it's really important. You should not overstate, otherwise you'll be shot down in flames. So I just wanted to have a few points about submission. I know the panelists will say much more than I will, but for me, as the writing end of the problem, we should not plagiarize other stuff. You take it, it's wrong, and it will be detected. And as a reviewer and editor, it's amazing how many times I've read a bit of a paper and said, this has been plagiarized for sure. And then I search on Google or use a plagiarism. A lot of the journals now provide their editors a plagiarism detector. That nothing is as damaging to your reputation as a scholar than being caught out on this. The word gets around, so don't copy. Authorship is a sensitive topic too, and I'm hoping our panelists might say something about this, but make sure it's agreed who'll be listed as an author. And there's guidelines on the web about how you can decide this. But the important thing is that there's some agreement about it. Some people will be happy to be just acknowledged. In general, each person on the author list should have contributed conception or design, writing, revision, or data collection, where data collection is non-trivial exercise. Make sure it's clear who's going to be the lead author. These days, the person that does the submission may not be the lead author, because the actual submission process is just filling in forms on a website. It requires care and some skill, but it's not the same thing as doing the science. When you're trying to choose which journal, this is the kind of logic I use. I look at what journals are already cited by the paper. That helps identify. If you want to go to a new audience, you avoid those. But often shows you what body of scholarship you're already working with. Others you often cite. Fits your topic, fits the type of article. If you've got a review article as opposed to an empirical article, different. Something your targets read. Match the level of significance, originality. That's a tough one. But you can try to send it to Nature Climate Change or to Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But unless you've got something really quite significant and original, it'll never be published. You're just wasting your time. Fits your budget. If you're going to go open access, it's very expensive. And to avoid is predatory journals. I won't go much into these, but they're ones that basically publish whatever you give them some money, they'll publish whatever you give them. And I think scholars tend to know which can help you detect which ones are likely to be predatory journals. Before submission is a good time to look at the title and the abstract again. The reason is, as an editor, when you have to make decisions on many, many papers, I don't read more than the title and the abstract in my first pass. And if it's not convincing, doesn't sound interesting, not logical, you're dead in the water, rejected before you go out to review. So treat the abstract really seriously, the final version. And you can even think strategically. While being honest, can you link your contribution to the journal's aims and scopes? I mean, because you think this journal is appropriate for your article, well, you should be. You might want to just tweak it a little bit to make it clear that it is. You can write it in a cover letter, but half the editors don't look at the cover letter either. No time. We zoom in onto the abstract and title. And then we read further if it looks promising. So to improve your writing, review the drafts of your colleagues, give comments and feedbacks to your colleagues. Read published papers, looking at the organization and arguments they use. Allocate time to revise your own work and look for feedback from others. Please, Professor Sangam, have a look at this paper I've got. And you say, no time this time, maybe next time. Okay, no problem. Let's seek help from others. And that's where I finish.
Thank you, Ajahn Louis. That was there are a lot of thought-provoking points that you have placed in your presentation, and I'm sure as we go into the panel discussion session, there'll be more that will come in as people discuss. And Agus here has shared the PDF of your presentation on the chat box for people who want to immediately later on look at it. But we would have anyways emailed it to our colleagues as well. But we thought might as well, since you mentioned that you would share the PDF and we had a copy of it. So here it's on the chat box and all of you can access it and download it. So as we go into the panel discussion, and we have Dr. Sangam Shrestha from AIT, Dr. Kanokwan Manorom from Ubon Ratchathani University, Dr. Pheakkdey from the European Forest Institute, and Dr. Pichamon from Deakin University, Australia. Thank you, panelists, for joining in. And as we move in, so the first thing that I want to tell the participants here is you listen to Dr. Louis, and we have the panelists here. You would have several questions. The best way to go ahead and ask a question is you could raise your hand and we'll call you out and you can ask the question yourself. Or you could type in your question on the chat box and we will read the question out in case you don't want to be called out. We could do that as well. So please put on your thinking hats and think about questions that you might want to ask. This is your great chance to think about things that have been bothering you as you're writing your paper, or you've thought about reflecting on papers that you've written in the past and thinking about how do you want to improve, or you would want to write in a higher impact journal. There can be a whole lot of different things. And like I said in the beginning, there is no question that is wrong or that is not worth asking. Every question is worth asking. So please do ask questions as we go on. To get us started, let me ask a few questions to our panelists, and I hope that will also get others into wanting to ask more questions. So I'd call upon Pichamon and Sangam to respond to the question that I have for you, both of you. So, and this is something that we asked during the icebreaker session as well, that what do you think, why is writing and publishing an academic journal important? Why do you think is it needed? I mean, we've seen the responses mostly referring to advancing careers, donor requirements. And since you both come with a lot of experience from very different fields, very different disciplinary backgrounds, it would be good to have you reflect a little bit of why do you think we like to publish academic journal articles from the research that we conduct. So first, Pichamon, if you could go.
Sure. No, thank you for that question. And thank you also to Ajahn Louis for that really comprehensive and useful presentation. As I was listening to Ajahn Louis speak and having spoken to him, you know, at an early stage in my career, asking him precisely about how does one go about writing an academic journal article and how does one even navigate the publication terrain in academia. I think one of the things that really struck me in that conversation with Ajahn Louis, but also with other conversations I've had with other academics since, is that of course a lot of it will be about the publish or perish consideration, that we have to publish in order to advance our careers. to make our kind of name known. And as one of my colleagues once put it, to put a stake in the ground and kind of demonstrate to others that this is my area of expertise. I'm the person you come to ask about these questions. But I think the other kind of prominent theme that's come through in the conversations I've had, and that I also personally believe in, is that it's really fundamentally about disseminating knowledge, right? And it's the opportunity to allow work to go out there and also be verified and tested by other people as well. And I think that's very much, of course, part of the scientific process, but it's also about accountability and transparency. I think increasingly, one thing that I've noticed is that, you know, once it becomes more about the publish or perish mentality, we care less about the transparency, the accountability, and the kind of the joy of disseminating knowledge itself and jumpstarting discussions and debates. You know, people are going to disagree with you, and that's actually a good thing. But I think increasingly, you know, and Ajahn Kanokwan in her kind of purpose statement used the term grand narrative in relation to poverty, but we're also seeing, you know, the attempts by some within academic circles to impose their grand narrative on what and how we should think about certain issues. So I think that's the beauty of publication. It's to, in one sense, subvert some of those grand narratives. It's to really challenge pre-existing assumptions, and also in one sense to challenge our own assumptions about what we hold to be the truth. So I'll stop there and hand over to Professor Sangam. But to me, it's more about that motivation, that almost normative motivation, as opposed to the simple kind of publish or perish attitude. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Sangam.
Yeah, thank you, Susmita. Yeah, Ajahn Louis' presentation was very, very comprehensive. Actually, I also learned a lot, although I write frequently, but there are, you know, many things I can follow from his presentation also. Yes, actually, I have the same opinion as Dr. Pichamon. The first thing is I want to disseminate the, you know, knowledge from the research I carried out. I want to, you know, contribute to the body of the literature. I mean, I want to add the value to the literature of the, you know, respective field of the study, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, yeah, I tell my experience to the, you know, early career researcher here. I finished my master's in 2002, right? And then actually, it was not compulsion to write the paper from the master's thesis, but I wanted to advance my career, right? So if you can publish in a good journal paper, I think that is good for your career. At the same time, you know, you can pursue your further studies like PhD. Nowadays, to get the good scholarships in many prestigious university, you must have at least 2 to 3 publications in very good, you know, journal papers, right? So that's the, you know, second motivation to publish the papers in good journals. Yeah. So I would stop here. I think there are many questions from the participants, and then I can respond to that. Thank you, Susmita.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll again actually call on you, Sangam, because you come from the engineering background and have been engaging with a lot of interdisciplinary research. What would be your advice in terms of finding the right journal for your manuscript?
Yeah, thank you, Susmita. I think that's a very good question. And in the icebreaker session, I saw that many of the participants, they already have some experience in publishing the papers, right? So if I were at that position, what I would do, or I share my experience, because when you start drafting your manuscript for the journal, the first thing is I have a lot of you know, references that have been cited in the text, right? And I can prepare a list of the journal papers that I have cited. So preparation of the journal that have been cited, that's the first step, okay? Because because you will cite in the text, and at the same time you have to prepare the references also, right? So that's the first step I would do. And every journal, they have their website, and they mention that mission, scope, and also, some of the objective of the journal, right? So you have the contents of your paper and see whether the contents of the papers are aligned with the mission, scope, and objective of the journal, right? So if the contents of the paper is not aligned with the mission and scope of the journal, I think editor will reject that at the submission. Okay, so that's the second thing you have to do. The third thing is you can also check whether the journal, they have been indexed in some of the databases such as Scopus, Agricola, Biological Abstract, Web of Science, right? So you can check those kind of indicators related to the journals. And of course, finally, there are several online tools available nowadays. What you can do is you can copy and paste the abstract that you have prepared, and then they can also search the journals for you. I mean, it's quite easy also, right? But sometimes they can show very high impact factor journals, and of course, depending on the novelty and also the originality of the manuscript, maybe you cannot go to that high impact factor journal, but you can select some of the the journals which have low impact factor, right? So these are some of the tips I can give to the participants. Thank you, Susmita.
Thank you for those important references and tips that you've provided. Any questions? Everyone is very quiet here, the participants. Anybody has any questions to ask? I'm not seeing anybody raising hands or typing on the chat box. Please, this is your time to really ask the questions that you need to focus on. And
Yes.
we'll see how a few more might come in as we go along. Sangam, you were mentioning something.
Yes, Susmita, actually, I want to follow up the presentation by Achan Lewis.
Okay.
It's related to the structure of the manuscript. Many of the journals, they ask to write results and discussion section in one section, right? Not this separate section. As I have been advising many students, masters and PhD, they have also difficulty when the journal asks to write results and discussion separately. And in my experience, I found that when results and discussion section is one section, the students will feel easy to write that section. But yeah, some journals, they ask to write it separately. So probably Achan Lewis can also shed light on that, whether we can go for results and discussion as one section or separate section, right?
Yeah, Sangam, thanks for your question. And my experience suggests that it's really good to keep them separate at the start, so that we can be clear when we're drawing on evidence from this research, whether it's interviews, direct observations, as opposed to when it's about interpretation and comparison and synthesis of findings and the integration into the literature. But I understand that when you actually come to final presentation, sometimes putting the results and discussion topics together may work. Even when it could work, I still prefer to keep them separate. I find, because I like my discussion to think about implications, think about limitations. I like my discussion to think about comparisons with the literature, to answer questions about under which conditions is this process important, under which conditions is it not. They go beyond our own study. The risk when you put it all together is that people don't actually discuss. They don't actually have the evidence for the claims they make. So a little bit of a difference of view with Dr. Sangam. I'm not worried about what the journal wants. This I'm talking about in the process of drafting. When you get to what the journal wants, of course, we do what the journal says. But that's a trivial final day rearrangement, I think. The important one is the style of thinking.
It's a style of thinking, and I think it also comes from some disciplinary training that we all probably undergo, and that's where the differences sometimes show up. I feel like that. But yeah, all of you would have your experiences and your styles of therefore looking at it. But that was a great one that you pointed out, Sangam, and thanks for the response. We have a question on the chat box from Kim Long, who's saying that between open and closed access journals, which one should be published and what are your recommendations? So I'll open it up to the panelists, and any one of you could respond. Maybe I'll invite Pheakkdey if you would like to respond to that, and then others can follow on.
Thanks, Susmita. I think I just go back to the presentation in Dr. Louis' PowerPoint, because it really comes down to whether you have to pay. And most of the time, if you do publish in open access, you do have to pay. And that can be also quite expensive depending on the journal that you might want to publish in. It can run into thousands of USD. So it really goes back to, do you have the funding to do that? And is it really necessary to do that? So it's very much down to the question of, is it required for you to publish in an open access journal? And do you have the budget to do that?
Any other views from Pichamon, Kanokwan?
For me, actually, I haven't paid anything to the journal. And so far, it's free. It's quite lucky. I don't know why, but we publish without the water alternatives and the lady with Geoforum, but we haven't paid anything. I think if you submit very important or significant paper to the right journal, or you choose the right one, and if the editor is very important, so as a gatekeeper, if you can convince the editor to accept you, not to reject your manuscript right from the beginning, so you have a chance, because the editor will send your paper to the reviewers. So we don't need to get rejected by from the start. This is very important. So I think it's up to you, as Ajahn Pheakkdey said. If you have money, you can go for the journal that you spend the money on that, but you don't have any money or the budget to support this because very expensive. You just go choose the right journal that you don't have to pay. I think you have to choose the right one, the relevant one to your paper. That's my suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can just follow up on what Ajahn Kanokwan was saying, I think it really boils down to the purpose of why you're writing. So I and my colleagues, for instance, have published in open access journals where you do have to pay a fair amount, but that was primarily because we wanted our research to be accessible to a wider group of people, especially practitioners who often don't have access to university libraries or other databases, journal databases, that is. So that was the main motivating factor. But otherwise, I think if you're publishing as an individual and your main kind of prime audience are researchers or academics as well, I would kind of encourage people sticking with the kind of closed access, even though that sounds terrible, but just the classical route, because again, you don't want to be paying that amount of money. Your research funds can be put to use elsewhere, such as fieldwork and so forth. At the same time, I think there are other avenues for you to disseminate your research. Even once you've published in a closed access journal, you can go with commentary blogs, you can write in newspapers, you can go to conferences. So I think there are alternatives, and open access isn't necessarily the only one to get your research to the kind of target audience that you have in mind.
Thanks, Pichamon. That's useful to know as well. Pheakkdey, you have raised your hand, so go on.
Sorry, I was muted, but thank you for calling on me. I think like moving a little bit to the next topic, which is actually in response. I think we have fully answered the question about open and closed journal, but just looking at the chat question, and I think that also leads back to the presentation by Dr. Louise, the advice for writing more than one article at the same time. And I think it goes back, so he presented like many different interesting ideas in the presentation, but I think the question can also be reflected in the one of the key idea, which is actually the importance of abstract. Because if you do actually have more than one paper that you might be working on, or you might only be working on one paper, what he said in the presentation that I took away with is actually the importance of having a very, how would I say, clear and specific abstract, and that having this really good abstract that you are working with, at least in my own experience in writing, is that for me, the abstract is actually a clear roadmap that I actually follow for the paper, and that it actually speaks to what are the arguments that I'm trying to make in the paper, and how do I make that argument? Is it like based on other people's publication? Is it based on the research that I'm doing? And also it constraints in terms of like what is actually relevant for my writing. And then it actually helped answer the questions of like, if you do work on more than one article at the same time, having this very clear abstract can actually help you focus when you switch back and forth between the different papers. And
Thanks.
so I like to also ask the panel or the participant to reflect a little bit more on abstract, because we did actually an opening exercise where you actually write about your purpose, and that actually should be a little bit further into like helping you structuring your abstract that you can actually follow as a roadmap as you do the writing.
Thank you for those helpful comments and responding to some of the questions on the chat box. And taking forward the conversation, I'll actually like to call on Kanokwan and Pichamon on, given your disciplinary backgrounds coming from the social sciences, do you think that journals have different expectations? I mean, do expectations vary across disciplines, and in terms of, not just the timing, but also protocol or the article structures? So if you could reflect a little bit on that, because that would be very useful as well, especially in the social sciences. I myself come from the social sciences, so have some experiences in that. And that's why I want you to reflect a little bit on this, because SUMERNET researchers are doing interdisciplinary research, but some of them do tend to fit into certain disciplinary journals, and it will be good for you to reflect on, from your experiences, what it has been like. For Kanokwan, if you could start off, and then Pichamon can add.
Thank you so much. I think based on my experience, I think there are some difficulties, challenges when you write the journal. I found that some journals, they have different region, maybe in America or in Europe or in Southeast Asian countries, and many disciplinary concerns. So some's very clear, but some's not clear. So it's very difficult for me maybe to make a decision what journal I'm going to go for. This is the first thing that's very challenging. And also sometimes some journals have like particular political positions, for example, antipode. So I read this some journals paper from this journal. I found it is very political background and radical geographical thinking, and the paper must be very rigorous and substantive in theoretical and empirical terms. So when you look at this journal, you have to think back to yourself, how I'm going to do this. And also another thing is about case study, how I present my case study, And to achieve what I have found in the field. So, you know, when you do the field work, you would like to present your field work in the journal paper. But to make sure that from my experience, I was asking myself why the journal might need to publish the paper. So why a journal might wish to publish my case study, why the referee, I mean, someone who review my paper are likely to recommend the publication, or why some scholars or the practitioners we want to download and read the paper. That's how I'm thinking, how I'm asking myself, or why those scholars might wish to cite my paper. So this case study is very important because it's based on the claim for novelty, which can be combinations among empirical, theoretical, or conceptual, or methodological apply. Maybe the focus on one or more than others, or combine of these 4 things. And also I'm facing the problem of how to make the words limits. You know, some journal require only 5,000 words. Some journals require 10,000 words. Some requires 8,000 words. So you have to condense your thinking, condense your idea, and put together in one paper in order to meet the requirement of the journal, the format. This is a very challenging as well. And the other challenging is about you have to wait for sometimes maybe 1.5 years or 6 months or 3 months, whether or not your papers are being accepted. So if you are a PhD student, you need to get the words from the editor. Okay, your paper is under reviews, and then we will come back to you soon. But for some papers, for some journals, they keep you waiting for a long time, maybe 1.5 years. My experience is at least 6 months, or sometimes I got like 3 months to be informed by the editor. So it is very challenging for me, and very difficult for me to deal with the editor. As I said, we need to convince the editor that your paper is very critical, very important, and the editor must see this, and you have to write to the editor and concisely telling the editor that why your paper is very, very novel and it's very critical and based on very unique or particular case study, and how you link particular case study to the larger or broader theoretical concept or larger regional boundary, for example. That's how my challenges, I have found.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know, and I'm sure everyone's making notes out of things that you're sharing in terms of your experiences, all of you. Pichamon, go on.
I think, again, I come from the social sciences, but we also have to bear in mind the variations that we see in the social sciences as well. Like, human geography journals, I think, tend to take less time from submission to publication compared to a political science journal, for instance, where it's quite normal to have to wait about 1 year to even 2 years. I've had a colleague who's waited 3 years for his article to get published. I asked him, why don't you just pull it out? He was like, let's just wait and see how long it'll take them. This might make the World Guinness Book. But, so there are huge differences within the social sciences as well. And I think that's important to bear in mind if you're obviously having to publish for that career development opportunity or to meet a certain employment requirement or donor requirement. And, please correct me if I'm wrong, fellow panelists, but I do feel like if you look at even how an article is written in some of the more sciencey disciplines or disciplinary journals, they will tend to be shorter, they will tend to be much more structured. Whereas if you look at an article in a social science journal, there will be a slight element of messiness in how it's structured. You won't write something like methodology as one of your sections. There won't be a discussion section per se, but it'll be much more narrative based, which means that they'll be much longer. So even the time that you, and I know that there's a question in the chat box about this, but the time that you have to invest into an article will also differ based on the journal that you're aiming to submit to, right? Because again, a social science journal, I've written one that's like 10,000 or more words. That's going to take more time, I would argue, than if you were to submit to a journal that requires just 5,000 words and is much more structured and much more focused in what they want from you. I think there was also another question about, writing more than one article at the same time. Obviously, that depends on the other stuff that you're balancing, and you shouldn't try to do too much. But at the same time, in my discipline, like political science, it's really normal for people to work on more than one article at a time, because again, we have such long publication periods that in order to kind of bide us over and keep us at peace, it is important that we do other stuff and write other publications in order to ensure that the sequencing of our publications is sound. Otherwise, we'll have huge gaps, and sometimes people do huge gaps in your CV in terms of, a publication in 2018 and then another one in 2021, for instance. The other thing I noted also is that, Boripat had asked the question about MDPI and whether it's a sound publisher or not, or if it's rather predatory. I think I agree with what you've written there, Boripat, in saying that its reputation appears to have been improving. But I do feel that it depends on the journal in question. And I get asked to review a lot for water or sustainability. But at the same time, for my discipline, MDPI and open access journals in general aren't still extremely well understood. And for that reason, aren't always well regarded. But I know that this, again, varies depending on the discipline that you're in. So I think in light of that, you do have to be very strategic. I know academics who sometimes will publish a social science, kind of political science article in a geography journal, and geographers who will publish in a political science journal because they can make claims to making new contributions because their discipline isn't aware of what another discipline is doing. And that's very strategic. I have my ethical qualms when people do that because it can be sometimes a bit disingenuous, but nonetheless, it does kind of underscore that point that I think you have to be aware of the different conventions that exist in different disciplines. You also have to be patient if you're going to be publishing in the social sciences, I think, and also mindful of how the article will have to be structured differently as a result. Thanks.
Thank you. That was Ajahn Lewis, you wanted to say something.
I did. I was wondering if I could show one slide to follow up quite a few. It's a slide that I didn't keep in my presentation.
Yeah, you could definitely pull that up and share. And there's a question on the chat box from Amy Cho, who's mentioned about how to search the journal websites that.
But that's what I'm answering.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sangam mentioned that there's a way that you put in the title and the abstract. Here are two of those tools on the screen. And one of the things it'll give you, for example, when you put in the title and abstract, it'll give you the impact factor, first decision, that's how quickly the editor will tell you, and the acceptance rate. So Pheakkdey talked about his publication in the chat box in Sustainability Science, has a very good impact factor. The acceptance rate is 15%. So if he was not confident about his paper, I don't think he would have submitted it there.
Yeah.
Right? You have to have a certain degree of confidence or assessment on the significance and novelty of your work before you would try to go to sustainability science. So I think these are really good tools for identifying other articles, other journals that you hadn't thought about. The ones that you already know is no problem. But sometimes this search will turn up something, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And then you can go through and look at it in the details. So that's all I wanted to share.
That's great. Thank you. Ajahn Kanokwan.
Yeah, I would like to share my experience about what the right journal. There's a very good question from participants. I think some journals more, if you go to the website of each journal, if you scope down your topic, because you know the topic you are writing, right? And then you search for the journals, but you might find sometimes some journals focus more on theoretical, for example, transactions of the IBG, or sometimes they specifically invite papers from Global South, for example, the Third World Quadrant, or sometimes they have an interest in policy and practice, for example, the development in practice, or even the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies is published in the Department of History of National University of Singapore. They mainly focus on like history, but not always like that, but it's not just regional or disciplinary. So maybe you look at the informations written on the website, and then you can decide which journal you would like to submit. Yeah.
Thank you. That's useful. So, Riddhi, why don't you ask your question?
Thanks, Sushmita. So it's just that once we are deciding which journal to go for, so I think, do you think that it's better to actually identify some special issues, which cater to specific topics, and maybe you can then match your title with those special issues and go ahead with, publishing in those special issues of specific journals. So is that also an approach that, we can take while we are looking for suitable journals?
Yeah, so I have a view on special issues from two angles, from being an editor and from being a participant. If a well-organized organization has a conference or proceedings or workshop, and they plan a special issue, and you are part of that special issues plan, it can be a good way to get a paper published, because you're working with a group of, especially if you're a more junior person, you're probably working with some of the leaders in your field. But be aware, as an editor, I know that special issues always run over time. So if this special issue is a type of journal where they hold all the articles back until they're all finished, it can be a disaster. This can be 3-5 years. But if they publish online as finished, not a problem. So special issues from the editor's point of view are always a headache, though. Nobody ever completes them on time. So,
Noted.
Pheakkdey,
I have one other point. We're thinking very carefully about what journal to publish in, so it gets published and gets reviewed properly. And no disagreement. I think there's a lot of agreement in the panel. But actually, from the point of view of the author, which journal you get published in almost doesn't matter anymore, because most things are found by searching. Most people find your readers find you by searching. So whether it got published in an Elsevier or a Springer, it actually doesn't matter. If you've got your title and abstract and keywords okay, well written, they'll find your article. It's not like in the old days when you went to the library, right? You took off the shelf the latest issue of the Journal of Southeast Asia, and you're looking excited to see if any of your colleagues have written anything. Today, we hit the search button with Google Scholar or go to Scopus, bang, whatever journal you're in, doesn't matter. So things have changed.
the World Wide Web is at our beck and call right now for everything that we want, really. Yes, so go ahead, Pheakkdey, and then Pichamon, and then Sangam.
Thank you. I think I just want to add a little bit to what Dr. Luis was saying in terms of special issues. I think I do see it a bit more beneficial in terms of actually having clear deadline. That of course, like most of the time, people do not meet the deadline and that it get extended. But at least like the usefulness of that, I find it as a communal activities that I do actually get to engage with the different people that are actually focusing on the specific theme that we are trying to address in the special issues, and that we do have like a timeline that we try to meet, even though it can get extended, but at least like it give, for me, myself, it give a clear indication in terms of the timeline that I actually need to finish certain thing and then submit and then actually be able to discuss with the group. And as Dr. Luis was saying, that usually the special issue come about when we do have like a conference or like where we have a panel and then we say, okay, these findings are very interesting. Why don't we just compile that into a specific theme? So then I find the experience actually quite helpful in terms of just engaging with other writers.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll just sorry, I'll just jump in and say that I think I used to get told that you don't want to do too many special issues because you'll get seen as tied to a particular group of scholars, or you might be seen like there was this view, I think, in the past, at least in the social sciences, that special issues had a slightly nepotistic vibe, that it was easier for you to get published as part of a special issue than if you went on your own. I think that attitude or that reputation has changed a lot, and articles in special issues do get treated, especially in really good journals, the same way as any other journal. So I don't think that remains the case anymore. But one thing that I will say, though, is that as someone who has submitted to special issues, I think it's the time factor. And if you don't feel like you can definitely commit to the deadline, then don't say yes to it, because as someone who has, missed deadlines, it's such a stressful thing. And so sometimes it's just easier for you to do it yourself, because there's not a huge difference anymore with respect to whether you join with a group or you go on it, go solo, basically.
Sangam.
Yeah, Susmita, I want to follow up with Dr. Louis' comment on which journal we should select for publication, right? So because many of you are early career researcher, I think it's very important for you to select right journal for your publications, because it is for your career also, right? The career advancement. And there are journals which are really prestigious in your field, right? For example, if you talk about water management, like Journal of Hydrology, Water Resources Management by Springer, Hydrology and Earth System Sciences, Water Alternatives, I think they are very, very prestigious journal, right? So if you have only one or two publications, I think this is very, very good for your career also. So rather than increasing the number of publications, I think you should think of a very good quality journal, probably one or two articles in those journals. I think that is very good for your career advancement, right? So I really would like to suggest spend your quality time to publish in good journals. Yeah. Thank you, Susmita.
Yeah, that's a very important point you make about quality over quantity, and therefore where to publish, and the questions around open access versus MDPIs, and all of this sort of come together in a really good way in what you just mentioned. That's really helpful. So are there any more questions from any of I've been seeing the participants are rather quiet right now. It's become a conversation among all of us, which we are enjoying, and hopefully you are learning from the process. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to raise your hands or type your question on the chat box. We'll take that on. And while you think about it and type your question, there's one question that I wanted to ask all the panelists, and we've dwelled a little bit on this, which is about which section of the manuscript do you think you should dedicate most of your time while writing an article? And maybe I'll start with Sangam actually, and then move on to the others.
Yeah, thank you, Susmita. I think we should ask the participants this question, right? So maybe participants can also respond to that, because we want to hear from participants which section they feel very difficult to write, right? So we can provide, answer on that.
Yeah, during in the session, in the icebreaker, they mentioned it was a discussion section that they find it difficult. And we've just turned the question a little around in terms of what your suggestion would be as to where should you spend most time when you're structuring an article, which section. So, and meanwhile, yes, participants, please tell us what you think. Where do you think you should be spending more time when you are thinking of your article? You can type in your chat box, or if you would like to engage with the panelists, raise your hand and we can get you to speak.
Yes, Susmita, maybe I can also start. Actually, we have structure in the manuscript, right? So I feel that all the sections are very important, no? From title to references, because every journal, they have their style or guideline. So even like references is not important, but if they are not prepared according to the guideline, then they will reject your paper, right? So every sections in manuscripts are very, very important. But at the same time, when you talk about the content, I think we should spend more time in results and discussion section, right? Because as Ajahn Luis also, presented in his presentation, I think if you look at the length of the words, probably results and discussion section will take almost 2,000 words, right? And that is the section where you want to convey your message, or you want to convey your results to the audience, right? So for me, you should spend more time in results and discussion section. Of course, like abstract and conclusions, maybe it can be done after you complete your results and discussion section. Yeah. So yeah, I want to hear from the participants, or later also. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, several of them have mentioned abstract, some have mentioned abstract and then discussion. Some has mentioned abstract and then introduction. Any other thoughts from any of the other panelists on this section you feel you should spend more time on? Yeah, Pheakkdey.
I think maybe this is like different for different people, but at least like for me, I find actually focusing a lot on abstract is really helpful in the writing process itself, because it actually really helped me to sharpen like what is the argument that I'm trying to make, and then how am I making that argument, and then actually help me to actually decide like what kind of evidence that I need in order to make that argument. And it also helped me in terms of actually just talking about like the article that I'm writing with other people, because most of the time you would just say, okay, this article, I'm trying to do this, and this is how I'm doing it. And then it's actually help in the process of writing. And then because like, at least in my writing process, I write out exactly what is the abstract, what is the argument, how am I making it, and how am I going to go about actually finding the evidence to do that. And then also like help me in terms of deciding like what kind of literature that I'm actually looking at, because there can be like, at these days and age, you can be inundated by just how many papers that you can read, but does it really fit in terms of like what is the argument or what is the question that you are trying to answer? And having a very clear abstract where you actually have a very specific actually question that you are trying to answer, it is helpful, at least for me. And then in the writing process, and then also in the submission process, it's also super important, because most of the time you do have to put in an abstract in the submission of the article. What is your abstract? And then most of the time you will be asked to talk about like the significance of the research in relation to the journal and so on and so forth. But also that in the review process by the editor, they of course will look at the abstract, and then they actually make the decision most of the time based on that. And so it's very important to actually pass through just the first stage of having a very impactful abstract. And then in actually people reading your paper, most of the time, at least myself anyway, I would just read the abstract. And if I don't really see anything that's interesting, I might just not read the article itself.
That's so Kanokwan, yeah. Go on.
Yeah, I would like to add to Dr. Pheakkdey, because the most difficult part for me is abstract as well. I would like to make sure that the abstract contribute to the disciplines or the field. That's how I'm struggling with the abstract writing. Given the word limit 250 words, that's very concise. You need to say critically. You have to say you have to bring the critical message, how you contribute to the field, how you contribute to the discipline. And for example, I'm working on political ecologies a lot. So I'm asking myself, does my paper makes a significant contributions to the study of the political ecology issue? That's how I'm struggling with. Yeah, it's very difficult given the word remit as well. Yeah, that's my experience.
That's helpful. Anyone else from the participants thinking of something? Has this stirred some thoughts and got you thinking to ask more questions? Ajahn Lewis.
Yeah, so clearly Sangam and myself don't share the same views exactly. But when we're talking about the time to spend and what's harder or easier, it's not the same answer. Right? I think the time spent on the results, of course, is very important. I agree with Sangam. But I don't think it's difficult. I think the difficulty in where the writing problems are often in the discussion and introduction. And one of the ways to reduce the problem, I think, is to have clear abstract. You know, if you've got your clear abstract, then you can start to filter out what is relevant, what is not relevant. The other trick is to work on the introduction and discussion together, because the introduction should very much set up the discussion. So Sangam says that the introduction is not that important in his papers. I understand that, because your discussion includes a lot of information, but then we have to make sure the introduction sets up the discussion. So the introduction can sort of write itself. When you have a clear statement of purpose, you know you have to give the readers a sufficient background. Really, the next important thing is really the rationale, right? The rationale for your work is really clear. Purpose statement, and then the research questions or something like that. You've done your introduction, but you have to make sure the discussion goes back to the introduction. So when we write the discussion, we're happy with the discussion, we realize the introduction is not correct anymore. Need to update it. So writing is an iterative process. Don't expect to get it perfect in one round. It doesn't happen. And then your best papers, or I'm sure if each of you reflect on your best papers, you probably rewrote it 3 or 4 times. You didn't get to the process of writing really helps bring out ideas. It really helps you, really forces you to bring out your arguments and realize that some of your arguments are quite weak. And in fact, there are things we need further study on. Nobody has even data about this, even though everybody claims it, asserts it, there's no evidence. So I think that we should, the writing process, don't be scared if you feel that you have to rewrite something. Most of us, in my history, most papers go through a stage where I write a really first rough draft really quickly, then I leave it for a while, I come back and I start again. But if I hadn't written the first version, I wouldn't have the questions, ideas, and thoughts necessary to write the second. So if you're only writing your second paper now, don't worry if you write it 3 times or 4 times. It's quite normal. And if you want it to be good, I mean, the other way you can judge it is to look at something you've published and you read it a few years later and you say, I wrote this. This is actually quite good. But you didn't get there in one step. You went through it 5 times before you got to that final version. But if you look at your final versions of some of your papers, you can actually feel quite proud. How clear it is, but it was not easy. So if you're a new writer, don't be upset when people critique and hammer it and say it doesn't make any sense, there's no logical flow, because it probably doesn't make much sense. It's the truth, the first version. But your third version is a gem in the making, and your fourth one is perfect.
That's so true what you just mentioned, and I mean holds true for a whole lot of different writing that one does, not just academic writing, but even other writing. Sangam, you have your hand raised, so go on.
Yeah, Susmita, I share the same views as Hassan Lewis. Now I'm talking about the length of the time we should spend to prepare the manuscript, right? So certainly the results and discussion section will take a long time, because we want to interpret the results. We want to have some significance of the results. Also, what are the strengths and limitations in the study, right? What are the future directions in the results and discussion section? So it will take long time. That's my opinion. But at the same time, I think when I myself start writing the paper, the most difficult section for me is introduction section. It's really very hard for me. Even it's like 1,000 word, probably I'll spend maybe 50% of the time to draft my introduction section. because it's a really, the beginning of your the whole manuscript to convince the editors and also the reviewers that why this study is very useful, right? What is the significance of your study, and what is the novelty, or what is the originality you are bringing in this study, right? So for that, I think you need a lot of time and effort to draft your introduction section, right? But in terms of the drafting the results and discussion conclusion, probably it's a little bit easier because you already have results, right? So you can interpret and you can discuss them. But introduction section is really very, very important to convince the editor and also the reviewers. Yeah. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Pichamon, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think in contrast to what Professor Sangam was saying, for me, it's the conclusion that's the hardest to write, in part because you've already written everything. So how can you actually make or write up a conclusion that's still interesting and makes people want to learn more about the topic or about the work that you're doing? And I always find that, by the time you get to the conclusion, you're already depleted of energy and you want to get this done, or you're kind of rushing to the deadline and you're like, I'm just going to cram everything I can into the last 500 or 350 words, however long it is. But I just wanted to pick up on, for me, it's not a section per se that I dedicate my time to. And again, it goes back to the fact that I work in the political sciences, but it's more the kind of the transition between sections. So for us, it's the connection between the theoretical section / literature review and the section where you discuss your more empirical findings, and ensuring that there is consistency, there's a clear logical flow between the two, because what you often get is people throwing in concepts and big theories, but then not really making that obvious connection to the empirical findings that they develop from their on the ground observations. So I think that to me is the most challenging, and as a result, the part that I tend to focus a lot of my time on. But just to kind of segue into, I think, an area that we'll talk more in terms of challenges also, for me, and I'd be keen to hear what people here think, both panelists and participants, I find that writing kind of like an integrated literature review has become much harder these days, in large part due to what Ajahn Louis said earlier about how easy it is for us to access information. And to me, at least, working on China, the first thing that comes up is the Belt and Road Initiative. And I don't think I need to tell anyone here that as soon as you search BRI in a search engine, you get basically overwhelmed with a lot of information, both good, both somewhat good, and sometimes really, really bad. So I guess I'd be keen to hear how people actually navigate and manage the information overload that we get these days in order to get to a stage where your paper kind of comprehensively takes into account what other scholars have done before you, but at the same time still retaining your voice and ensuring that your paper doesn't get overloaded by all of the information that's out there.
That's a great question that you asked, Pichamon, posing a great question, and I think there's a lot that one can reflect on. And if any one of you would want to just reflect on that, Ajahn Louis.
There's one other slide I pulled out of my presentation that I'd like to share.
Sure.
And that is, I think we can sometimes draw pictures or have a model to try to sort out which relationships our particular study is interested in and which ones are the work of others that we don't need to. So choosing, I like to draw pictures. I often have a conceptual framework. And sometimes they are only used in the drafting stage and I throw them away. But sometimes I keep them and actually write the results and discussion section to follow this framework. So the recent paper we did in the SUMERNET SC members more or less is structured around a larger conceptual framework about sets of associations. I think you can use this in almost any style of, it's kind of systems thinking, which means you can use it in almost any discipline. You can be focused on actors rather than processes, if you like. Not a problem. But this will be one of my take homes is don't be scared about drawing pictures. If you're struggling to structure an argument or decide what's in, what's out, you can't figure out how to draw an introduction, you might need a bit work more on the conceptual framework for the paper, as opposed to your overall project or your overall dream program. The paper often has a more succinct and well-defined conceptual framework. So I'll stop sharing.
Thanks. Yeah, that's something that even I like to do with everything, that to conceptualize it figuratively, because that helps you to broaden the scope of also what you think and then slowly narrow down. And that works for designing projects, that works for structuring papers, and for the kind of research that we all have been doing. There's so many elements. So yeah, that was great, Ajahn Louis, that you shared that. We've almost come to the end of the workshop session, and there's a question from Boripat here. And Boripat, why don't you just open your mic and speak to the question?
Yeah, thank you to all panelists for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been a really interesting to hear your different experiences and opinions. My question is, sometimes when I read papers, and even working with Dr. Louis as well as someone who's experienced with Dr. Louis, sometimes when I read the abstract discussion and conclusions, it can read a bit repetitive sometimes, like the same message said over and over again. And I'm wondering, do you see that as being an issue? And if yes, how do you overcome that? Thank you.
Who would like to take that question?
Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Bolipat's very good question, because I did that too. Not just Dr. Louis. I often did that. It's normal. It's a part of our thinking. It's in the process. I think to overcome that, I was asking my friend, or critical friend, I would say, critical friends who maybe are academics from other universities in Thailand, overseas in English. So to kindly ask them to review the paper before I submit to the journal. That's my what I did. And maybe you just take your paper along and go to any conference, and then maybe you discuss, present that as like just a draft paper, and then you receive the feedbacks from the participants, and then you revise the paper. Yeah, that's how I did. That's overcome the redundance of the messages. Yeah, that's a very good question.
Thank you. Yes, Ajahn Louis.
Yeah, I think the overlap between the abstract and the discussion, or abstract and conclusion, is not an issue. The abstract has to stand on its own. A lot of the search engines and everything will only look at the abstract, won't look at the whole paper. So you must put it in the abstract if it's important. Repetition between the discussion and conclusion, I agree with Kanokwan on this one. That shouldn't happen. I think your conclusion, you have to think about how you use the conclusion section, which is the point Pichamon was saying is difficult. My suggestion is not to make the conclusion too long, because if you write it very long, you tend to repeat the discussion, or you repeat your introduction. My suggestion is the conclusion has no citations in it, so it doesn't repeat things that are elsewhere. Maybe 2 paragraphs at maximum, maybe 300 words, 400 words maximum for a conclusion. And the conclusion should lead towards practice or policy or something like that. Yeah. But there should not be overlap between discussion and conclusion.
Yeah, Pichamon.
Yeah, that's again a great question. Something I still struggle with. I think for me, I tend to tell my students to think about writing like a pyramid, right? So you start, as Ajahn Louis was saying, very specific, be specific about what the purpose of your article is and so forth. And then gradually, as you develop and you get towards the end, I think you can afford to be a bit broader in terms of how you kind of, in one sense, you can talk about other stuff. You can start posing bigger questions, reflecting on the broader implications of the findings that you're presenting, or the unanswered questions that you're still grappling with in relation to your paper. So I think there's that opportunity to really leave it at like a cliffhanger almost, where you can entice the reader to keep
Something.
reading. Yeah, exactly, to keep reading what you're writing. I know this might like not be the most appropriate example to give, but you know, like those Marvel movies where towards the end after the credits they have a bit of a teaser trailer to give you a glimpse of what's to come. And I think you can actually do that in your conclusion as well, right, to give people an idea of what you'll be working on after this.
That's a great suggestion, actually. Sangam, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree to Dr. Pichamon. Actually, you know, abstract is you know, giving the contents of the paper, right? Because normally it's less than 200 or 300 words. It's a content of the paper. You're describing the content of the paper, okay? And conclusion, I think it's you know, mainly findings of your study. So maybe there are repetitions in discussion and conclusion, but I think maybe not all these sections are repetitive. No, yeah, that's my suggestion. So this content, what is the main objective of the study, and what are the methodology you have adopted, and what are the major findings is the abstract, right? But conclusion is, what are your statements, or what are your, you know, findings from your results, right? Those are the conclusion section. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we've hit noon and almost at the end of this session. I hope it has been
Sashita,
useful.
can I say final point? I think
Yeah, sure,
everyone's
sure.
get experience about being rejected, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes, it's very, because you put on this, but we haven't talked about that. I think if we submit to art to another journal after being rejected, right? I think it's my experience. Seriously, we have to consider why it was rejected, and the same referee might read or review the second paper as well to make sure that you have to be careful about that as well. Yeah, I think that's my final point. Yeah.
Sangam, did you want to say something on that, on revising manuscripts, and also if you get rejected, how you addressed or overcome that?
Right. Yeah, normally journal, you know, rejects based on the novelty of the work. If you do not bring, you know, substantial, you know, contribution or originality in the study, they will reject right away, right? So, and there are some other, you know, reasons of rejection also. If the manuscript is written very poorly, of course, there is novelty, but language, you know, grammar, style, not following the author instructions, and that can be rejected at the editor's level, right? So there are several reasons, but the main reason is novelty of the work, the originality of the work. What is the difference between other, you know, studies, you know, compared to your studies, right? So those are the main things of rejection. This kind of grammar, style, it can be improved, right? Revising the paper, I think it is based on the reviewers' comments also, right? So if it is a major revision, I think you should list down all the comments provided by the reviewers and read them very, very carefully, because, you know, reviewers spend a lot of time to review the paper, and most of the reviewers, they are doing their volunteer job, right? So they are not paid for that. So it's very, very valuable. So you have to read the comments point by point, right? And revise based on the comments and suggestions. Maybe you can argue some of the comments, but you have to provide very, you know, genuine reason why that particular point cannot be revised. Yeah. And when you make a revision, and you must have some response letter. I think all the journals, they ask a response review letter. And while preparing the response review letter, you have to be very, very polite, because again, you know, reviewers, they spend a lot of time and they care. When you submit the revised version, the reviewer who reviewed your manuscript, they will read it very carefully, how you have responded the review. So you have to be very, very polite. At the same time, it's not that you cannot argue. You can argue, but you have to give the valid reasons, right? So very careful reading and polite response to the reviewer are the main, content of the revising the manuscript. Thank you, Susmita.
Thank you. And I think with that, I'd like to come to the end of the session. And as we come to the end, I'll invite Madam Long to close the session with her closing remarks. And in the chat box, Agus would share the link to sharing your thoughts on how this session went and what do you think could be done better. This is really crucial for us because this will help us also in improving on our skills and how we do these sessions in future. So please do respond to the link in the chat box. And over to you, Madam Long.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very, very interesting discussion. So on behalf of the SUMERNET Secretariat, I would like to thank all of you, especially the panelists, for the great session. I hope that all the participants here will have gained a lot of from the session, and they are feeling very confident when they go back with the academic writing from their old projects. And I also would like to let you know that maybe in the next 1 week, we will welcome as many of you to share your abstracts with the secretariat, and you will have opportunity to get it reviewed. So once again, thank you very much, and all the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you heard what Madam Long just now said. This is your opportunity to share your abstracts in the next 1 week. Whoever wants to, there's no pressure, but you'll have some support from the Secretariat to review it, including some of our panelists who will come on board and help review some of those abstracts. So go on, take this opportunity, and hopefully several of you will respond back. So the timeline is from now till the next Thursday. In this period, do take a chance. And as Ajahn Louis keeps saying, that this is a session, get your abstract in place. Don't spend 3 days writing that abstract, but take half an hour or 2 hours, depending on how you feel. But put together an abstract and share it with us in the next 1 week. And let's see if we can help you review and get back to you. So thank you so much. And thank you, panelists and Ajahn Louis, for this great session. I really enjoyed having this conversation, and I'm sure all the participants have learned quite a bit from the session as well. And I hope you're all chiming in on the survey and letting us know what you think of the session. Thank you so much. And see you again on the next session. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.